Nick will be here to talk to us about something that is very close to my heart because it sounds like a Doctor Who episode, alternative universes. So please welcome up Nick and he'll explain it. It's all about climate change, I promise. Nick.
I was very worried when I saw that I was down as a motivational speaker. What a hell of a responsibility. Parallel universes I want to talk about, and I also want to talk about money. And because I've been with the UN Environment Programme for 12 to 13 years, and before that I was a journalist. I was the environment correspondent of the Times newspaper in London, and so I followed this whole climate process for many, many, many years with two different hats on. And we sit here right now and we are talking about how to deal with climate change. Over on the other side of the river, governments and others are talking about how to deal with climate change, and there's an incredible amount of talk going on. That's why I want to talk about money. Let me talk about money in one respect. Let me talk about putting a price on carbon. Every year, UNEP comes to these meetings, these conference of the parties, to the Climate Change Convention, and we try and come up with a different theme, something that might echo to, you know, people walking around, seeing our posters, seeing our brochures. And this year we put a theme out called "The Future is Priceless, Put a Price on Carbon." You know, currently there is no price on carbon. No price that means anything to anybody. There basically is not a price on the pollution that large companies and countries are actually spewing out into our atmosphere. Basically, a lot of those companies, a lot of the way we live our lives, a lot of the businesses around the world are on a free ride. They're on a free ride. There's an interesting consultancy in London, a consultancy called True Cost. And they've been doing some work for something called the TEEB for Business Coalition. They've been looking at something called externalities. I don't know if you know what externalities are, but externalities are, in a sense, how business actually passes on the cost of their production to you and me, in terms of air pollution that makes people sick, in terms of overusing water, so that some poor people in many countries can't get access to water. So externalities can be actually captured in economics. And True Cost reckons that the top global 100 environmental externalities of the business and industry on this planet is costing the worldwide economy about $4.7 trillion a year. $4.7 trillion being passed on from companies like power companies, the cement sector, cattle ranching in parts of Latin America. In fact, the report makes it clear that if you actually had to, as a power generator in a place like, say, East Asia or North America, if you actually had to internalize what you're passing on to the rest of society in your own ledgers of profit and loss, many of these companies would be loss-making industries. And that doesn't even get into how many subsidies and the value of the subsidies that are given to the fossil fuel industry. So that's the bad news. Let's talk about the parallel universe again, because there's tons of good news. Tons of good news. If you look at what's happening on this planet in the last just 10, 15, 20 years, nearly 140 countries now have renewable energy targets or policies in place. You look at a little country like Costa Rica, which has set a target of being a climate-neutral country by 2020, no emissions or no net emissions. If you look at Denmark, planning to generate 50% of its electricity from renewables by the same date, by 2020. There's some good news there. If you look between the year 2006 and 2012, $1.3 trillion invested in new renewables. This is an incredible story. If you look at the International Energy Agency, or you look at any of the large institutions in, say, the year 2000 or 1999, what they were predicting would be the uptake of renewables by 2012, they were fantastically off the mark. That's not to criticize them. Just to say that, in fact, the reality is extraordinary in comparison to where we were on renewables. And if you look around the world, we are actually littered with fantastic examples of sustainable development, of climate-friendly development. Uganda, where something like 200,000 farmers have gone organic. They're getting more money on the export markets for their pineapples, maybe 3 times. They're saving money because they're not using fertilizers and pesticides, which is good for the environment. And they're practicing a form of agriculture which is less carbon generating. You can go to many, many other places in the world and see really positive development. Companies are moving. You look at a company like Unilever. They have, for example, a sustainable living plan. It's very ambitious. It's about reforming the way that they do business. You look at some of the financial sectors. Storebrand, financial services group in Norway, made a determined announcement that it was going to pull out of investments in coal and oil tar sands. So lots of very interesting things happening in this world that we're living in. And yet the fact remains that despite all this action that you can see around the world, the fact remains that if you look at what is really happening with business, and if you look what's really happening in terms of decarbonizing this planet, well, you only have to look at the New York Stock Exchange. There's an organization called Carbon Tracker. They looked at the carbon intensity of the New York Stock Exchange in the last 2 years, well, between 2010 and 2012, I believe. It had gone up, the carbon intensity, 37%. The London Stock Exchange, 7% EVO. Nice to see you, EVO. So, what is the missing ingredient in this climate change challenge? I like to say it's money. And it's money in terms of the missing ingredient being private capital. How can we focus the capital markets of this planet on what you might say is climate change, but you might want to say is real wealth generation? Because over the other side of the road, or the river, the governments are struggling to put together $100 billion a year for the developing countries by 2020. $100 billion a year. It is peanuts. And it's peanuts without the S, right? It's peanut. $100 billion a year. When, if you look around the world, institutional investors like the pension funds, insurance companies, investment funds, in the OECD alone, they have over 70 trillion euros under management. That was in 2011. 70 trillion. And we're struggling to find 100 billion governments from the public purse when there's all that private money out there. So what do we need to do? I don't have all the answers. You may be surprised. But we need to do something about how we deal with these capital markets. We need to somehow generate a concept, as I said, of what is real wealth. We need to move beyond GDP. You know, with GDP goes up, we're all happy. GDP goes down, we all feel a little sad. But the fact is GDP is a very crude indicator of wealth. It's very silent on environmental damage. It's very silent on many of the social aspects that make this world a place that we like to live in, that generate jobs and other things. So maybe if we look at maybe a few litmus tests for this financial capital market dilemma, this parallel universe that we're in. Can we, for example, introduce a new sense of responsibility? Can the reinterpretation of financial responsibility and the responsibility of financial institutions be changed? Something called fiduciary duties, for example. Can we have more information, in a sense, on what companies are actually doing to our world? You know, something like 25% of the large corporations on this planet report on their environmental, their social, and their governance footprint. But about 75% do not. How can we change that around? I met a young lady at the airport when I arrived here at Chopin Airport from Germany, who was coming to this meeting. We were talking about finance. She said, I've got 20,000 euro. Where do I invest it? I pointed out that, you know, I actually had a bit of a hole in my bank account. And I could direct her to the sort code and the IBAN code. But no, she wanted to know, where do I invest my money? And that's just a private citizen. Where do the pension funds want to invest their money? They would like to invest it in long-term sustainability. But they only have a relatively small group of corporations that they know what they're doing to assess whether they are a long-term risk or whether they're a long-term gain. So we could do something about information. Incentives, what kind of incentives can the world put in place to kind of do the right thing? You know, we were talking before about fossil fuel subsidies. You know, whether you look at the numbers and the exchange rate, it can be $500 billion, $800 billion. Christine Lagarde of the International Monetary Fund talked about over, I think, nearly $2 trillion the other day of kinds of subsidies out there. So we need to change the rules of the game. The rules of the game are not actually working right now in favor of climate change, in favor of sustainable development generally. The rules of the game of the banking and the financial capital markets are not working that way. There are some good signs. If you look at China, the Chinese Banking Regulatory Commission has now brought out green credit guidelines. These are innovative and quite interesting. South Africa has brought in some rules on pension-related legislation that encourages the trustees of pension funds to take sustainable development, climate change into account. So it's kind of starting, but we need to, as the cliche says, we need to scale up, we need to accelerate. We need to move much further and faster in terms of reforming those sectors. We are living in a world right now where the science of climate change is incontrovertible, despite what some skeptics say. It is incontrovertible. It is incontrovertible that the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are right now at the highest level for 800,000 years. That is incontrovertible. It is incontrovertible that sea levels are rising. You can measure it. It's incontrovertible that the sea level rise off the Philippines has been far higher than anywhere else in the world, and in part is highly likely to have contributed to the fact that that typhoon that landed on that island with the impact of a nuclear bomb was aggravated by sea level rise. The science is incontrovertible. The economics of waiting to deal with climate change are incontrovertible. You can play around with the numbers. Is it 4%, 5% of GDP? Is it this or that? But we will pay more for this the longer we wait. What I'm suggesting is, if you're going to deal with climate change now, if you're going to deal with sustainable development, the finance now needs to follow the economics, as the economics have followed the science. If we don't do that, we will continue to live in parallel universes where they will still be debating on other sides of rivers about what to do with a process, and we will never achieve what we all want to achieve ultimately, which is a sane, sensible, equitable, honest world in which we all have a chance to actually fulfill each one of our destinies. Thank you.